Now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villeminot. Hi, Flo.
Jeannie.
In the wake of the deadliest mass shooting in the United States, gun control has been in the spotlight all around the world. What's the situation like here in France?
Well, it's radically different than in the United States. Gun laws are very strict here in France, and it's our word du jour. Gun control is called the contrôle des armes à feu. You can see it coming up here. Now, as a member of the European Union, France is in line with something called the European Firearms Directive, which sets a minimum standard for the acquisition and possession of firearms by civilians. Now, each member state is free to adopt more strict rules, if you will, and that can explain the slight differences between different European countries. Now, in France, it's quite tricky to acquire a weapon. You have to jump through all sorts of hoops. If you want to buy a gun, for instance, you have to, first of all, acquire a hunting license or a license for shooting sport, and then you have to apply for a permit with state authorities. It's quite a lengthy process that actually requires a psychological evaluation, essentially a medical certificate saying that you're sane enough to own a weapon. Now, applicants with any criminal record are automatically refused, and there are also restrictions as to how many weapons people can own. Individuals can't own more than 12 firearms, and they can't own more than 10 magazines or 1,000 rounds per firearm.
Obviously, again, very different from restrictions in the United States. Obviously, the aim of this here in France is to keep people from buying guns, and yet gun ownership is actually quite high in France.
And it's a little bit tricky to find up-to-date figures, but if you look at figures from 2007, there was a world comparison of private gun ownership. France actually ranked number 12 in the world. Now, the estimate of the total number of guns held by civilians, so legally and illegally, is somewhere between 10 million and 20 million. So that's pretty high for France, given that the population is about 67 million, but it's nothing compared to U.S. levels. Let's take a look. If you break it down over 100 people, you can see that in France there are 31 guns, whereas in the United States, 112, which means there are actually more guns than people in the United States. And also, if you look at the number of gun-related deaths, it's a very different story as well. France in recent years has had an average of 1,800 firearm deaths each year, compared to the United States, 33,000. Do keep in mind that the American population, of course, is a lot more. It's 323 million.
Now, most of the roughly 3 million legal guns here in France are actually owned by hunters.
Hunting is quite big here in France. There are approximately 1.4 million registered hunters here, making France the biggest hunting country in Europe. Hunting is actually the third largest sporting federation after fishing and football here in France. It's huge across the socioeconomic spectrum, and particularly in rural areas. And this might explain why gun laws in France are a little bit more relaxed than in neighboring Germany and in the UK, and why France is one of the most armed countries in Europe, along with Finland and Switzerland.
But as you mentioned before, there's also a huge number of illegal guns that are circulating in France.
And it's really hard to know just how many illegal guns there are here in France. Some of them are left over from the Second World War, for instance, but experts say that most of the guns arriving in France these days actually were originally used in the Balkan Wars in the 1990s.
After the fall of the wall and the breakup of the Eastern Bloc, most of the arsenals of those countries were emptied. We saw a massive influx of those arms on French territory.
Now, Europe's porous borders have made it really challenging to fight this illegal arms trade, and the issue has become especially pressing since the 2015 terrorist attacks, because keep in mind that assault weapons like Kalashnikovs were the main weapons used in these radical Islamist terrorist attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan.
Now, those attacks changed many things here in France, including a bit of a culture change within the French police itself.
Now, gun laws are so strict here in France that up until recently, the police were restricted as well. Up until November 2015, police officers that were not allowed to carry firearms while they weren't on duty. And it was almost a philosophical statement about what French society should be like. But, of course, all that has changed since the recent terrorist attacks.
If there had been armed police officers during the attacks, they could have fired back. They may not have been able to save everybody or foil the attack, but if they had saved 10 or 20 people, it would have been worth it.
There are 100,000 police in France. If you allow them to carry their weapons, even off duty, you increase the number of people who can intervene.
And that's not the only cultural change that there's been in the police since the recent terrorist attacks. Traditionally, municipal police, so local police, not national police, weren't armed. And now mayors actually are allowed to ask for permission for their municipal forces to be armed. Now, it's a very symbolic change, but it's interesting because many people actually agree with it.
We don't feel as safe as we did 20 years ago, so we have to adapt.
We're in a period where we feel less safe. So if the local police are armed and they're there for us, I don't see a problem.
The question now is, could there be an even bigger change in gun culture in France on the way?
Well, what's interesting is the most vocal critics of French gun culture are actually in the United States. There have been many pro-gun politicians who have made headlines here in France for saying things like, if all French people were armed, there wouldn't be terrorist attacks. Now, most French people think that kind of reasoning is a little bit ridiculous, and in general, debating gun laws is quite taboo here, but there have been marginal calls to relax France's very strict gun laws. It must be said these are usually calls that come from far-right fringe groups, and these groups are quick to point out that apparently a kind of right to bear arms was almost included in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789 right after the French Revolution, but it wasn't included, and perhaps that can explain why there's hardly any gun culture here in France, or in Europe for that matter. It really isn't part of our founding myth like it is in the United States.
Indeed. Thanks so much for that, Flo. Florence Villeminot with that very interesting look at gun culture here in France. So don't forget, if you have any other questions for Flo about how things work here, you can always send her a tweet at Flo Villeminot.